Good afternoon and welcome to the Pierce Atwood webinar. We will be discussing today opportunities under the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, how, what, and when. My name is Merrill Kramer. I am a project development and finance partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the law firm Pierce Atwood, LLP. Joining me on the panel this afternoon is my partner, Chris Amick. Chris is a tax partner in the Portland, Maine office of the firm. Chris is co-chair of the firm's Energy Infrastructure Development and Finance practice. Also joining us on the panel is Karen Berry. Karen is managing director of NT Solar, where she directs the company's team in originating, structuring, and underwriting renewable energy tax credit investments. NT Solar is a national tax investment and advisory firm specializing in renewable and community tax credits. NT Solar is an affiliate of the National Trust Community Investment Corporation, and we are delighted to be having Karen join us. In the next hour, we will talk about the key provisions of the IRA and how they may affect your project. We've organized the webinar into three segments. In the first, we will summarize the energy tax provisions of the Act, including the effective date of these provisions, with a focus on some of the bonus provisions, the direct pay, and the transferability provisions. In the second segment, the panelists will turn to key practical questions that have been raised regarding how the provisions of the Act work, some of the open questions regarding the Act and its operations, and how the IRA will affect deal terms and structures. In the last segment, we will turn to your questions. Now, to facilitate your questions and our answers, I would direct your attention to an icon on your Zoom screen. It's marked Q&A. At any time during the course of the webinar, please feel free to post a question. We may answer some of your questions during the course of our interchange, but we're going to try to hold the questions for the last segment, which would be the last 15 or 20 minutes, where we will try to answer as many of your questions as we can. If we can't get to some of your questions, we will try and circulate answers to your questions in the coming week. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour and 15 minutes until 1:15. The webinar is being recorded and will be reposted for rebroadcast at a later time. So with that, welcome, and we will get started with an overview of the Act. Okay. Got it. There we go. So the Inflation Reduction Act restores and extends, as most of you know, the full federal investment tax credits and production tax credits for solar, wind, and other renewable energy projects with a hitch I'll discuss in a moment. The investment tax credit, or the ITC, is available for solar, geothermal, biogas, fuel cells, waste energy recovery, combined heat and power, small wind property, microturbine, and microgrid property through 2024. And the production tax credit, or PTC, is available for wind, biomass, geothermal, solar for the first time since 2005, landfill gas, trash, qualified hydropower, and marine and hydrokinetic resources, also through 2024. After 2024, both the ITC and the PTC are replaced by a technology-neutral clean electricity investment credit in the case of the ITC, and a clean electricity production credit in the case of the PTC. The Act also adds a new tax credit for standalone energy storage and contains major tax provisions to spur electric and hydrogen-fueled vehicles, alternative fuel refueling stations, nuclear power, energy efficiency, biofuels, carbon sequestration, and clean hydrogen production. As I mentioned, the ITC and the PTC now come with strings attached. To qualify for the full 30% ITC and the 2.7 cents a kilowatt hour PTC, projects must now pay prevailing wages during construction in the first 5 years in the case of the ITC and 10 years in the case of the PTC years of project operation. And they must also meet the registered apprenticeship requirements, which we'll come to in a second. The Act also includes bonus credits that in the case of the ITC can increase the credit up to 60 or 70% if the project satisfies these additional criteria, and a similar degree of increase in the PTC. For the first time, the Act also includes tax credits for companies manufacturing clean energy equipment in the US, like solar panels, wind turbines, inverters, and batteries, as well as companies that process critical minerals to the renewable industry in the US, like cobalt, lithium, nickel, graphite, and vanadium. For projects, solar projects under 5 megawatts AC, the IRA also contains a benefit where interconnection equipment may be included in the basis of the ITC. The Act also contains a valuable cash payment option that allows certain organizations, generally tax-exempt entities, but also clean hydrogen, carbon sequestration, and advanced manufacturing to treat certain tax credit amounts as payments of tax or direct pay, which Chris will talk about in a second. Taxpayers not eligible for direct cash payments can now for the first time sell their tax credits to unrelated parties, the so-called transferability option. So with that quick summary, we're going to spend a little time now talking about some of these key provisions that have the most impact on the solar, wind, and storage industries, but also on other renewable projects. So let's start with prevailing wage. Chris?
Yep. So as Merrill mentioned, the PTC and the ITC now come with strings attached. I like to think of it as now effectively a two-tier credit. And whether you think about it as a base credit with a multiple or a single credit, which is similar to the old credit that gets reduced if you don't meet certain requirements, either way, it's the same. You end up with the same economics. And so with the PTC, right, we're at 2.7 cents now, or 2.6 cents, maybe 2.75, depending on the rounding under these new rules. Or you have a lower credit, which would be 0.3 cents indexed to inflation. With the ITC, you have a 6% base credit multiplied by 5 to the 30% credit we're all familiar with. Now, the difference between these two, between the very small credit and the healthy credit of 30% or 2.7 cents, is whether the project meets the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So these are really critical to get us to the same credit we have been sort of expecting and have had over the prior years, other than the phase downs. So that's why it's important. The prevailing wage standard is something that needs to be met sort of during construction as well as during service. So we're talking about operation, we're talking about repair, we're talking about any capital improvements that are done during the tax credit period. So for the PTC, that's 10 years, for the ITC, that's 5 years, and for the carbon sequestration credit, that's 12 years. So those are important things that need to be monitored going forward, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later. The apprenticeship requirements similarly also have to be met for this period of time, and what they're going to say generally is that some percentage of the work that's done on the project needs to be done by qualified people by apprentices, people who meet that standard. And the amount that needs to be done by the apprentices goes up over time. So right now, these rules don't apply. We'll talk about that more now. So right now, the answer is 0% needs to be done by apprentices. But after we get after 2020, beginning in 2023, when construction begins on a project, you're going to need to meet 10% of your hours are going to need to be done by apprentices, going up to 12.5%, and then 15% in later years as well. So really important stuff we'll talk about a little more later.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. So one of the bonuses that are available to developers now under the IRA is the domestic content bonus. The full bonus is 10%, and like the other bonuses, it's dependent upon a project either satisfying the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements or being exempted from those requirements because the project began construction prior to 60 days after Treasury issued their guidelines. And that's a common frame on most of these. The effectiveness of most of these bonuses, both the carrot and the stick, is the key to when the Treasury comes out with their guidelines. The domestic content bonus consists of two central parts. One is that the project must use 100% U.S. steel and iron for steel and iron parts. And for manufactured products, the components of those manufactured products must contain an adjusted percentage of products that are mined, produced, or manufactured in the U.S. Now that's a big statement, and the devils there are in the details. But mainly what that provision is saying, unlike the U.S. iron and steel, is that when you have a manufactured piece, the question is, well, maybe it's assembled, the final manufacturing is in the U.S., but what about the components within that? I mean, do those have to be manufactured in the U.S.? And what about if you get into a subcomponent? What is the origin of the subcomponents? What does that need to be, and how are they going to measure all of this? This is one of those rules that will depend upon what Treasury says when they come out with their guidelines, which are expected next year. But by reference to the IRA itself, they make reference to the Buy America rules, and those do provide some guidance right now, which basically say that when you're talking about a manufactured product, all of the manufacturing processes have to take place in the U.S., and all of the components of the product must be of U.S. origin. That being said, under Buy America, at least, a component is considered to be of U.S. origin if it's manufactured, i.e. basically assembled, put together in the U.S., regardless of the origin of the subcomponents. So again, the devil is in the details of how far you have to dig into this, and then the question is, how do you protect yourself in terms of deal structure to ensure that what you are putting in is actually of domestic content on both of these points? So beginning with the effectiveness of the rule for the manufactured products, the adjusted percentage is 40% of the product must be U.S. manufactured for most qualifying projects. But for offshore wind facilities, the adjusted percentage begins at 20%, and that amount then increases, as does the adjusted percentage for domestic onshore wind, solar, etc., which are set at 40%, in 2024. So that would mean 20 projects that began this year. Well, the rule wouldn't be effective until Treasury comes out with their guidelines. So if they come out with their guidelines next year and you begin construction after 60 days after the guidelines have been issued, the initial percentage for those projects would be 40% for 2023, but also in 2024, with the step up not beginning until 2025, both for most projects and as well for offshore wind. There are two exceptions to the domestic content requirement, even if you it applies to you and you're not exempted under because you began construction prior to Treasury rules coming out. One is if to satisfy the requirement, this would increase your overall cost of the construction by more than 25%. And the other is if the relevant product is not produced in the US in sufficient and reasonably available quantities or quality. Under those circumstances, the unavailability of the product is counted 100% against the adjusted percentage. In other words, the adjusted percentage would be calculated as if 100% US content was supplied for the unavailable items. Chris?
Yeah. So one thing I'll add on to what Meryl was saying is I've seen this mistake made. No, you can go back to where I was, Meryl. Is the 10% bonus both for the domestic content and the energy community bonus I'm going to talk about right now applies differently in terms of the math for the ITC and the PTC. So with a 30% ITC, I've had the question, okay, if I get a 10% bonus, does that make the ITC 33% or does it make it 40%? The answer is it makes it 40%. Now, on the PTC, if you have a 2.7 cent PTC, 10% bonus gets you to 2.97 cents. So you can see that although it's called a 10% bonus in terms of cash, the ITC is really increasing your credit by 33%, whereas on the PTC, it's really increasing it by 10%. So it has a real impact on economics and really potentially the choice between taking an ITC and a PTC, as we'll talk about later.
But
so,
let me,
community bonus.
I'll just add to that, Chris, because that sounds well, then in that case, I'm going to take the ITC, is that the ITC is measured based upon the installed cost of the project or total cost, whereas the PTC is taken based upon the production of the facility or the kilowatt hours that are generated or other unit. So even though you measure it differently, what you multiply it by can differ significantly.
Definitely. So the energy community bonus, I'll just sort of mention this briefly. So you do get this 10% bonus if you are in an energy community. And it's only the 10% bonus if you do meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. If you don't, it's a 2% bonus. So it will get you from 6% on an ITC to 8%. An energy community, just briefly, it includes brownfield sites, as defined under the under CERCLA, Comprehensive Environmental Response and something Act. Sorry, I can't remember the entirety of that. It also applies in areas where coal, oil, and natural gas has had a significant tax revenues associated with that, and there's been an rise in unemployment in those areas. And it also applies to areas where coal mines have closed since 1999, or coal plants have closed, coal energy generating plants have closed since 2009, or any census tract that's connected to a census tract where that happens. So in my head, I think of this as the Senator Joe Manchin provision, right? These were designed to make this more palatable to our Democratic senator from West Virginia. Pass it back to you, Meryl.
Yeah, so I would add to that. Originally, we had timed this webinar to the elections, thinking that there might be some impact of the midterm elections on energy policy up on Capitol Hill, and obviously that it appears that that's unlikely to occur. But the thought did occur to me that if the result of this new, the midterms is that we would have 51 senators, then perhaps if that had occurred when this bill was passed, some of what we call the Manchin provisions may not have appeared in this bill, such as this one. So the next bonus is an environmental justice bonus, which can be in the amount of either 10% or 20%. As Chris mentioned, that 10% would increase if you had a 30% base bonus, i.e. you've met the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, so you get the full 30%. This would increase it to 40%, and the 20% bonus that's also in here would increase the total bonus amount to 50%. So you can see if you have those and you have the domestic content bonus, you could get up to 70% conceivably. So on the environmental justice bonus, the 10% bonus amount is for projects located in, or I would say, or serving low income communities as defined in section 45D of the code, basically LMI communities, low to middle income, or are located in or servicing Native American lands as defined in the Energy Policy Act of 1992. The 20% bonus are for projects that are part of either a qualified low-income residential building project or a qualified low-income economic benefit project. A qualified low-income residential building is a housing project that, such as the ones that participate in or under the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, the housing program that's administered by the Department of Agriculture under the Housing Act of 1949, a housing program administered under the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996, or a similar affordable housing program that has been established. And finally, and this is another one where the devils might be in the details, there's the financial benefits of the electricity produced by the facility must be allocated equitably among the occupants of the dwelling units of such building. We don't have a lot of guidance on that, but we do know that the Act specifically says that the financial benefits include the sale of power at below market costs to those that fit within these customer categories. A qualified low-income economic benefit project is one where you're serving a community or a building where at least 50% of the financial benefits of the electricity go to households with an income that's less than 200% below the poverty line, or to a community where less than 80%, where the households earn less than 80% of the area's median gross income, another term that is defined in section 142 of the code. As I mentioned, for purposes of figuring out what the financial benefits are, the one thing that is clear is that the sale of electricity at below market rates is part of the financial benefits. Now, the environmental justice bonus is limited, unlike the other bonuses that we just mentioned, the domestic content and the the energy community bonuses. The environmental justice bonus is available only to solar and wind projects that are 5 megawatts AC or less, as well as to storage projects that are associated with solar projects. The bonus is limited to 1.8 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity in each of calendar years 2023 and 2024. And a project must receive an allocation of that 1.8 gigawatts from the U.S. Treasury Secretary. And as we'll discuss shortly, the rules as to how that's going to be allocated have yet to be articulated.
So Meryl, before you turn from that one, we had few people ask the same question about, how to figure out whether a census tract is qualifying for this. And it is the new market tax credit census tracts. And so those are, if you Google new market tax credit census tracts, you'll find lots of helpful mapping tools that use Google Maps. Novogradac has a really good one. That's the one that I have bookmarked and go to, but a number of others do as well.
Okay. Great. Standalone storage, as I mentioned, is a new credit that is now available. And again, projects that meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements can now qualify for the 30% ITC. The projects have to have a nameplate capacity of at least 5 kilowatt hours. Standalone energy storage encompasses many different kind of storage technologies, including thermal storage and hydrogen storage projects. The standalone storage credit is, we'll get to in a second, is available for projects that are placed in service in 2023 or later. And again, and like other credits, if the project begins construction prior to 60 days after Treasury issues their guidelines, well, this is not one, but that relates to the to whether you get the full credit because you're exempt from the wage and apprenticeship requirements. We already mentioned that if you are a project under 5 megawatts AC, you can claim the ITC on your interconnection costs. Interconnection facilities are defined to include even those facilities that are owned by the interconnecting utility. So any upgrades that a taxpayer has paid for, those can all be included in and added to your basis for purposes of calculating your ITC as well as your bonus ITC. So it gets incorporated. It's not a standalone tax credit or incremental tax credit, but just something that gets added to the basis.
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about direct pay and transferability, which are the new ways to monetize these tax credits. I'll go quickly because I know we'll get to a lot of discussion with Karen about how these things are going to work and how they're playing out in the market. But we just want to make sure everybody understands sort of the basics before we get to that. So, in my 15 years I've been doing this as a tax lawyer, I've had a number of clients always say, I'm going to sell the tax credits. I'm going to sell the tax credits, and I cringe. And that's why I have less hair than I did 15 years ago. Because folks like me have to give tax opinions that say basically this isn't a sale of tax credits. And so now with transferability and to a lesser extent direct pay, you actually do sell tax credits now. So it's interesting, and I'm not gonna lose night's sleep over people saying sell tax credits anymore. So that's just a little bit of background on me. And so direct pay is tax exempt organizations, I think, as a lot of people probably know, haven't been able to work in the renewable space sort of the same way that others might, because tax exempt organizations don't pay tax credits are not valuable to them. So we have a lot of structures where we have service agreements, PPAs between developers and tax exempt organizations with a purchase option after the tax credit period is over, so that the nonprofit tax exempt organization has the way to benefit from the credit without actually taking it themselves. Direct pay changes that a little bit, or changes it a lot, because now tax exempt organizations will be able to claim the credit themselves and get a refund for it. So if the tax exempt organization has $0 of tax due that year, which might be the case, or it might have some tax, and there's a $100 tax credit, the IRS is going to write them a $100 check when they file their tax return. So it's a nice way to benefit those tax exempt organizations, and might change the calculus for how tax exempt organizations, put solar on their facilities, et cetera. And this applies to, as I said, all tax exempt organizations. So think charities, think, a lot of golf courses and clubs and things like that, which are tax exempt. It also applies to municipalities. So I think that's probably going to be, municipalities will probably be a big user of this program. And then tribes and state governments, et cetera. And it also applies, I say that it applies to tax exempt organizations, but it also applies to the carbon capture, hydrogen, and advanced manufacturing credit, regardless of who's claiming it. So Meryl, if you go to the next slide there, we'll just talk briefly about transferability. So transferability is really about the sale of tax credits. And so this allows, eligible taxpayers, which are everybody other than people who can claim direct pay. I think it on here says eligible taxpayers do not elect direct pay. It's actually that cannot elect direct pay would be a better way of saying that. And then the credit has to be transferred for cash, has to be transferred to somebody who is unrelated to the person who would originally be claiming the credit. So this is, potentially a game changer in the tax equity market, but we'll talk with Karen about exactly her thoughts on whether it actually is a game changer.
Okay. So I'll run through this in the interest of time fairly quickly in terms of how the timing of these provisions and everyone, I think, has to be mindful of these. We are going to make these slides available after the webinar. We will post them and distribute them as well. So you don't have to get writer's cramp taking down notes. So the ITC, the base ITC, to qualify for that, your project could be constructed at any time prior to, well, it has to be prior to January 1, 2025, when the ITC goes out of existence. But it can be but it must be placed in service no earlier than 2022, no later than December 31, 2024, when the clean electricity credits replace both the ITC and the PTC. So for the base amount, your project could have already gone online before even the act was enacted in August in order to qualify for the basic ITC and PTC. Not so with some of the other credits. The standalone energy storage credit, as well as to qualify for the step-up basis for interconnection facilities, is only applicable to projects that are placed in service beginning in 2023. The prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements also become effective in 2023, but not before 60 days after the Secretary of the Treasury publishes, I think it's Treasury, maybe it's Labor, but one of the secretaries publishes guidelines on prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. So there you have a consideration is if you think you're better off not meeting the prevailing wage requirements, you'll say, well, maybe I should put my project in place this year, although as we'll discuss later on, the guidelines will not be coming out this year. So you do have a window of opportunity. But on the other hand, if you put the project in online this year, you would not be eligible for some of the bonuses for the storage credit or for the interconnection facility increase in basis. So domestic content also is for facilities that are placed in service after 2022. And here the beginning of construction is important, the date that you begin construction, because beginning in 2024, the applicable percentage, or 2025 rather, goes up from the 40% for most projects and 20% for offshore wind, and increases each year beginning that should be 25 through 27. For the energy community bonus, again, it's not applicable for projects unless they're placed in service after December 31, 2022. However, if you have a project that is being refurbished, additional construction, or there's reconstruction or erection, that part of your capital, your CapEx, would qualify subject to the the existing IRS rules on what's considered to be new build or incremental build. Environmental justice bonus, the rules will be issued within 120 days, must be issued within 120 days of enactment of the statute. So that 180 days, I'm sorry. So that would place the rules governing the allocation and who gets the environmental justice bonuses sometime in February, I believe. My count is correct. And the rest of these I'll just make available so that we can get into the Q&A, which I think is more interesting. But again, it's something where you have to be mindful primarily of when you place the project in service, but for many of these bonuses, or for many of these, for example, the domestic content, when you begin construction is going to trigger what your obligations are under the various provisions. So with that, I'm going to take off the slides. And go to my panelists. So before we get too much into the weeds, let me throw out the first question for Chris or for Karen. I think you both can take it. So most people generally understand how the 30% ITC works and the $27 2.7 kilowatt hour PTC works. Will these credits work any differently after the IRA? And will the market for project equity look any different for these projects? Karen, why don't we start with you, since we haven't. Yeah.
Well, you'll have to prove more about your projects. If you can get your project placed in service between now and when the IRS comes out with guidance, you can get the 30% credit without having to prove wage and labor standards. So I think there are a lot of developers who are rushing to do that. I think moving forward, if you think you're going to have an adder and be getting more than 30% tax credits, you'll have to recalibrate how much tax equity and debt you have in your project to balance out, because these are more tax credits. It's another potential source of capital in the capital stack, but you're not getting more revenue in the deal. So how are you going to pay back the various parties that are in the capital stack? If you think you have domestic content, or you're in an energy community, or maybe you even think you can get 60, 70%, you might not be able to have any debt in the project, or the revenue might not cover a pref for the tax equity at all. I think that's one of the things for developers to look at. In the decision between ITC and PTC and transferability, frankly, we looked at this. I remember looking at this way back when, in 2005, when you could choose PTC for solar. It would have to be a large utility scale project that whose build cost is about what its future fair market value is, so there's no step up in basis, and be more than 30% efficient. For the PTC numbers over 10 years at maybe like a 6.5% discount rate to equal what you could get on an ITC up front. So that's just a rule of thumb.
And just in those analyses, I mean, with utility scale solar, now being built at, well below $2 a watt, is that, I mean, obviously that's very different than in 2005, where you had, I don't know what the prices were then, but significantly higher. How does that?
Well, because the PTC is based on production values and the ITC is based on the eligible basis. And eligible basis changes between utility scale and middle market and C&I deals because the fair market value is different. If you're selling power to a utility at sub 3 cents a kilowatt hour, your future fair market value isn't going to be much higher, if any, than your build cost, no matter how low your build cost is. So you may not be getting a benefit from ITC up front because it's just going to be based on build cost, but you still have the differential of collecting money over 10 years instead of in the first year. And interest rates are rising. 6% discount rate may be low. We may be looking at 7-8% discount rates for the money you earn on production. And in a solar project, if you're in the Northeast or somewhere like that, it just isn't going to pencil. You need to have probably single axis, at least single axis trackers, and be looking at and be in an irradiance area where you can get more than 30% efficiency.
Okay. I've heard it spoken in just general terms that the ITC, which is based on capital costs, make more sense for projects, generally speaking, on the, in the Northeast or the East Coast, or the Mid-Atlantic, whereas projects that, say solar projects that are located on the West Coast, where you have more exposure in general, it's worth taking a look at the PTC, which is measured based upon your output, even if your capacity might be limited. But following up on your question, on your comments, Karen, so you have an increase in the tax credit piece of the stack, of the capital stack, resulting from the IRA. And what that does is it reduces, as you said, either the preferred or it would reduce the debt burden in there. From a practical standpoint, how does that shake out? Is your you would think your cost of money would be cheaper, but I'm not so sure because
well, it is, because tax equity is cheap. People don't like to admit this, but let's say and tax equity's gotten a bad rap lately, and I'm not sure why.
Totally undeserved.
Totally undeserved. If you're getting tax equity, let's say $1.10 a credit, and tax equity is going to take a 2.5% pref on their capital contribution, what you really have is a short-term 5 to 7 year mezzanine loan for the amount of the capital contribution. The federal government's going to pay back most of the principal, and then the value of the losses and the cash are going to pay back whatever else the tax equity investor's getting. And so your effective interest rate on that is 2.5%. I don't think there are any debt providers out there right now that are doing 5 to 7 year terms with 2.5%. So tax equity is cheaper than debt. If you could layer in more tax equity, I think it makes sense. But I think most tax equity providers would still want the sponsor to stay in for 20%. That's typical project finance requirement, maybe even a little more, because the tax equity doesn't want to be in first loss position. Tax equity will still be senior to sponsor equity, but still it's at 2.5%. So I think that's going to be an equation that we're all looking at over the next year.
Okay, so it sounds like that if the tax equity is going to squeeze the debt in the capital stack, it's going to, and since tax equity is cheaper than debt, it's going to increase the margins and make these projects a lot more valuable to developers along the line. Just, in terms of some of the basic questions, I've heard this, and maybe Chris, you can clarify this. So you have these bonuses, and at least most of the questions that come up about the domestic content bonus, the energy community bonus, the environmental justice bonus, is the uncertainty associated with those, unlike the basic ITC, PTC, because there's so many undefined terms and it's unclear whether in fact a project would qualify for those, whether they're in one of these zones, whether they're in a census tract, whether, the financial benefits, quote unquote, a standard is met. If, and I have many clients who currently are in the process of selling projects, or making decisions on, on going online where they're trying to bring in tax equity, where it's unclear between the buyer and the seller of these projects what the likelihood is and what the risk is of a bonus occurring, or there being denied, or there possibly being a risk of recapture. Can you, given the uncertainty that may, or at least the perceived uncertainty, greater uncertainty with these bonuses, is there a way in which a project, well, first of all, are these bonuses different from the ITC, PTC? Can you segregate them? And can you say, okay, the sponsor, I'm going to, since you're not going to give me full value, you're going to discount, add an increased risk premium to these bonuses. I'm going to keep them myself. And, as a sponsor, I'll stay in the project to maintain those.
No, the bonuses are not separate credits. They're just increases to existing credits. So it's not as if you can separately allocate or hang on to the domestic content bonus.
Okay. So, is it, another question that has come up is there a way that you can split this pie of tax equity where perhaps part of it you sell it through the transferability provision, and part of it you use conventionally in a partnership flip or master tenant or other relationship type of structure?
Unless we get some very liberalized rules from Treasury, the credit can either be transferred or it can be claimed by the partnership and the partners who put the project into service. You can't segregate it and say 40% of it's going to be transferred and 60% of it is going to flow up in the normal course. So what you can do, and so I see this from a couple of different perspectives, right? If you're a developer and you're going to sell a project at NTP, or sometime during the process, sorry, some weird stuff is coming up on my screen here, then you're valuing your project at that point based on what you expect the credits to be, right? If your project might benefit from a domestic content bonus, but you don't know if it does, you're likely going, this is what we're seeing in our documents, is you're going to have contingencies related to that. You're going to have contingencies. So if there is, and you just need it to be shared, the increased value for that bonus, for example, would be shared between the buyer and the seller in a way that makes all parties, desirous to have it received. So it's not all to the seller who has no control over the issue going forward, et cetera. And then, when you're doing a tax equity transaction and you're thinking about, okay, well, what happens if I get this bonus? Really, my recommendation to my clients is always make sure you're in there with a tax equity investor who understands the benefit of the additional credit and is willing to give you sort of full credit for that. And I think most tax equity investors are willing to do that. We have often change in law provisions within our documents that say, if the law changes, then, and the credit is greater, then tax equity investor will contribute more capital. That's very common, sometimes with caps, sometimes without caps.
Right. All of our term sheets, all of our term sheets include flex up provisions and accordion provision. But I'm getting the question that you're talking about, which is, okay, if we model this and price it and close into a partnership at 30%, we later find out it's 50%, can we sell that 20% off? Well, no, only the owner of the original credits can sell anything, and you're in a holdco partnership that's 99-1 to the tax investor. If you did sell it, the tax investor would get 99% of it. I don't see any way to separate them out after you're in the ownership partnership.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So how do you structure a deal, Karen, where under a flexible arrangement where you have a tax equity provider who is willing to say, well, sure, I'll give you the tax equity based upon X, but if it goes up to Y, then I will participate and we will share it in some fashion. And the question is, how does that sharing work in practice, and how do you do so in a way that the sponsor will be incentivized to pursue those additional bonuses that both parties are incentivized and both of them are rewarded?
I gotta tell you the truth, if I were a developer, I'm not sure I'd go for the domestic content rules or maybe even the environmental justice rules. They're difficult to prove. Is the candle worth the wick? I'm not sure. So again, that is up to developers out there to figure out how much it is worth to them. But in terms of term sheets and how you shake out the economics as you go along, what we do is define the economics. We define the target ROI for the investor. We define the target exit value and coverage ratios if there is debt in the project. And like I was saying earlier, what that ends up meaning, if you end up expanding the amount of credit in the deal, the tax equity investor will invest more, but you will have to back out probably the same amount out of your debt. If it's back leverage debt, I think that's a lot easier. I think it will argue for always doing back leverage in these projects instead of having any debt at the project level. And the other thing that I had mentioned earlier, something you will have to model for, is whether or not there's still enough revenue in the project to cover any kind of a pref on an expanded tax equity contribution.
Okay, and by back leverage debt, you're talking about putting the debt one level removed from the tax equity.
Well, the lender has the sponsor as their guarantor instead of the project.
Right. Okay. Okay, so now what also happens, assuming that that's how you're going to structure the tax equity arrangements, you also have a situation where projects that are being sold at NTP the projects that are being structured and the sale price is being established pre-tax equity, because at that point, tax equity is not at the table. How do the buyer and the seller split the baby, or what types of new provisions go into that deal structure to account for the fact that there may be additional bonuses, but there's uncertainty associated with those bonuses?
I am not sure that the purchase price from a developer who's going to stay in the project in the financing between them and an EPC or a channel partner, whoever they're buying the project from, really depends that much on the tax credits. I think it's really about what it actually costs to build it and what are seen as legitimate markups along the way. And that's still going to be between 15 and 20%. And it could be, if you're a vertically integrated company, you have a number of those places for markup, but whether or not the ultimate owner of the project can take the tax credits is I don't think the first thing that is in the calculus in a buy-sell arrangement.
It's not, but as you say, and I've run into this with clients and we've been in negotiations with this, when you plug in the bonuses, and that increases the tax equity and decreases the debt, that increases the value of the project, and that creates a different dynamic.
If I were the one buying a project in that situation, I would say, yeah, and it increases my risk, and I'm going to take that in exchange for the potential increase in my return. But here's the price I'm offering you.
Okay.
It drives a hard deal.
Yeah.
I think it's a fair point. I definitely understand that one. So Meryl, we're coming up on 1 o'clock. I know we're done at 1:15. I would suggest maybe we probably talk about transferability and those impacts on the market.
Okay, I think great. So Well, since you raised it, Chris, let's turn to you. Can you just briefly explain how direct pay differs from transferability and what the considerations might be? But also transferability. Let's start with transferability because we've talked about direct pay before. What are the mechanics of transferability, and how does this whole concept of transferring or selling a tax credit work?
So the idea behind it, and we have other tax credits largely in the state tax world, which we call certificated tax credits that can be bought and sold, just like any other sort of intangible asset. And the idea here really is to create a second market for tax equity where you're able to sell that tax credit at a discount to somebody who can use it, which is I think a lot of lay people, when they hear tax equity, that's what's in their head, right? That's why my clients always said I'm selling the tax credits. It's much more complicated in a traditional tax equity world. And the question that I have in my head is where you're selling a tax credit on some of these, state tax credits we work on, it's really simple because there's no recapture risk. There's little worry about indemnities and things because of the way the state tax credits work. And that's probably not going to be the case here. So my question in my mind is, how much simpler are we really talking about with transferability? And I don't know that I know that yet. I don't know, Karen, do you have any thoughts on that?
I've priced out a couple of deals on this, and I think the reality is there are 2 or 3 big differences between financed tax equity and transferred tax credits. Transferred tax credits are cash for credit. Yeah, maybe in a couple of years we get to certificated arrangements where it is a commodity, just like the state historic tax credits, and my company does those too. But right now, the buyer is not getting the value of the losses, which is how most of the return has been paid in other situations. I've seen a couple of people predict that the price per credit of transferred credits would be somewhere between 85 and 95 cents. And that puts the tax equity return on that purchase of credits at somewhere between 15 and 5%. I think tax equity is making around 17% right now, and that is paid from cash and losses. So maybe that's where they shake out. But the other thing would be the indemnity. There is a penalty. The risk transfers to whoever buys the credits. And if there is a penalty, it's the penalty of whatever basis they disagree with plus 20%. So I think there's going to have to be a deep pocketed indemnity behind that. And the third thing is you're not getting the markup. You're not getting the markup on basis. Most of the developers today are using fair market value as the basis, unless you're a big utility developer. If you're anywhere in the middle market up to about 35, 40 megawatts, the value that your project is earning over time through PPAs, RECs, whatever else, is almost certainly higher than what you're paying to build the project. And the markups can be between 15, 20% and 50%, maybe even more in the Northeast states. So you're not getting that markup. The transfer is based on cost. As far as we know, maybe they're going to say FMV. That's one of the things to watch for. And there's no value to the buyer of losses, and the buyer's taking the risk. So you are going to have to provide some kind of stiff indemnity. I honestly don't see it penciling unless you've got the kinds of projects I've seen it penciling for are standalone battery storage where you don't know what the future income is going to be. So you're just going to use the cost as the basis anyway. And it would be hard to finance a tax credit on that, again, because you don't know what the future value is going to be from the sale of power from that standalone battery. It's almost always going to be merchant. Maybe there's some capacity that's fixed in there. So that and then the advanced manufacturing makes sense for that because you don't know what your future income is going to be on that either. So if you don't know what the future income is going to be, you don't care about the basis, go for it. And you have deep pockets to offer an indemnity, go for a transfer.
What do you see a difference? I mean, it sounded like what you're talking about there was largely focused on ITC. What about transferability on PTCs?
They're already transferable. You can trade them after the first year anyway. So I don't know if that will really make a difference.
Well,
One thing that I've heard people talk about is at least on the PTC side, is is there going to be a debt market essentially that takes into account the future value of the transferability, and you transfer on a year-by-year basis. So with just a pledge of those revenues and as a way of financing, essentially bridge lending on that piece of it. So now your lender is taking the risk and not worrying about the time value of money.
Well, Chris, that might have made sense when interest rates were at 3 or 4%, but they're not anymore. So I don't know. I don't know where that shakes out.
Yeah.
okay. So let's it's now it's after the hour. Let's go to the questions, and just looking through them, the one I think this is a nice segue from our conversation into this one. When we talk about direct pay and we talk about tax transferability, how does the depreciation get treated? That and how do you deal with that in those situations? Go ahead, Chris.
The short answer is it stays with the project owner. I've heard people talk about doing a tax equity transaction on just the depreciation, which we saw a little bit of in the 1603 grant world, in the early 2010s. Those, I don't have a lot of hope that those would be really significant, especially with a corporate AMT, which is going to limit the losses from those depreciation on projects like that. But otherwise, I mean, I think, where transferability might make sense is where you have a developer that has income from a number of sources, operating projects, et cetera, where they might want to hang on to the depreciation themselves because they have use for it and don't have a need to monetize it. And then in the case of direct pay, I mean, you're largely dealing with tax exempt organizations there. So the depreciation really doesn't have a benefit to anybody unless they have unrelated income.
Completely agree, Chris. I think the other thing to keep in mind on direct pay, and I don't know how many of your client your client bases would fit into that category, but if you're not going to finance the project, you're going to have to pay for it up front. So, maybe TVA can issue bonds with a low cost of capital and build the projects themselves and hire someone to operate them and take the credits. But one of the big benefits of financed projects with tax equity is that whoever's buying the power doesn't have to pay the upfront cost. So in a direct pay, you would.
Absolutely.
Are there any questions from one of our participants, attendees? How do regulated entities, how are they affected by the IRA? How do utilities now play, whereas in the past they may not have been able to play in this world of tax equity and and all of these benefits? Is it through the direct pay provision, or are there other ways in which they can now participate?
I don't think it changes that much for them, honestly.
I was thinking the same thing, Karen. So, I mean, utilities wouldn't participate in direct pay because they're not exempt organizations and don't fit in any of the, I suppose they could be. I don't know of any utilities that are exempt organizations, but other than maybe some rural co-ops, I think.
Yeah, rural co-ops and municipal utilities.
But they don't have upfront cash unless they're going to borrow it from the Rural Utility Service Loan Program, federal government.
Yeah. They don't have a better answer to that question.
Okay. There's a question about the definition of brownfield. So under the energy community bonus, projects that are located on a brownfield site obtain this bonus. The comment is Treasury is currently reviewing stakeholder comments. Does the Treasury have the power to expand the definition of brownfield to include these projects? let me add to that, at least in looking at this brownfield issue, which is, as Chris mentioned, is derived from the CERCLA definition of brownfield. It's a fairly large definition, but the rules themselves are not clear what located in a brownfield site means. And Karen, you were talking about Section D of CERCLA, which seems to pare back the broader definition of what's a brownfield site.
Yeah, I'm not sure why they did that. The larger definition of brownfield site is good and would, I think, have been really helpful to developers who have access to that kind of location for build sites. But subpara D pulls a lot of that back. And I think there's going to be a lot of review of subpara D to see if, oh, does this exclude my site? I thought it was going to qualify. And there were a lot of comments in the comments submitted to the IRS so far about what? So I don't know what that's going to end up being.
Yeah, and I think the most impressionable observation on this is that subparagraph D may exclude CERCLA sites that have been fully remediated or mitigated. Well, does that mean that you have to actually build your solar wind project on an open, super fun? Yeah, which no one's going to do. So how exactly are they going to implement this? And does it all have to be located on the site? Could it be partially located, or so those are some pretty important questions in terms of trying to encourage people to reuse sites that otherwise would not be used for putting up renewable energy.
And that's the question there about, does the Treasury have power to do this? Maybe, probably not. But the way I think about it, having seen other questions like this in other areas, not renewable energy, Treasury, if they see that the intent of Congress really wasn't met by the language because of something unintended, they will use their authority to spend as much as possible, under the theory that who's going to question them. We're working with what Congress intended, and generally, some congressmen are going to write about that and explain to the IRS what they intended, and then this is good for taxpayers, so taxpayers aren't going to challenge it. So it's possible that you get some good guidance on there that's helpful. But if Treasury says, you know what, this goes too far, they'll probably send it back up to Congress and say, include this in a technical corrections bill at some point.
Maybe we will get a technical corrections bill.
It's very possible. We got a lame duck session, coming up right now. And wouldn't it be crazy to have a tax extenders bill with technical corrections and things? That's pretty common this time of year.
So, but Chris, I think relating to this, we talked about the uncertainty between now and whenever the Treasury comes out with their rules and regulations. How will projects, tax equity investment, how will people deal with this uncertainty until their final rules, final guidelines, maybe even beyond that, that come out from Treasury or from the IRS?
No, in terms of documentation, it's all about flexibility. Which is the kind of stuff I like. In my practice is drafting provisions to deal with all of the various possibilities that might come up. And moreover, my recommendation to people in dealing with these uncertainties is make sure you trust your partner that you're working with. If you're dealing with a tax equity partner, you're dealing with somebody you're selling your project to, make sure you feel like you're working with somebody who is going to, honor your intent and not try to squeeze out every last dime, but try to do repeat business with you by treating everybody fairly. I think that's good advice in everything, but especially in areas where there's uncertainty going forward.
Absolutely.
Okay. We're running close to the end. There's a question about whether LMI customers can be used for qualifying for the community energy community solar benefits or the environmental justice. I think that is the intent of this. and this is one of those cases, just like prevailing wage, where the states are ahead of the feds. And I think they're going to take a lot of guidance from these programs that have been instituted by states directly to try and bring in underserved areas into the benefits of renewable energy there.
I was looking at, Meryl, I was looking at, if you divide 1.8 gigawatts by the 5 megawatt rule, that's 360,000 yes allocations. Of course, it'll be more than that because not everything is up to 5 megawatts. But you're right. States like New Jersey, Massachusetts, Washington, D.C., Maryland, California, more than a handful of states already have rules like this, that if you are selling more than half the power to low moderate income subscribers and you're giving them a 20% discount, let's say, you qualify for a state program that gives you adders on the renewable energy credits, that requires utilities to buy half the power at a fixed price, so it's easier to finance. There are a lot of state programs that already are intended to incentivize that kind of a program. And I hope that the federal government, the IRS looks at those. I think those state programs were put in place while the folks on the Hill were drafting this language, and the state programs really just leapfrogged what was happening at the federal level because it took so long.
Well, yeah, I agree with you, but that's the way to go. But conversely, what I'm also seeing is some states that have put out various incentives for things such as prevailing wage and domestic content and the like, are now saying, well, now that the feds are offering those benefits, maybe we should be paring back our programs. They don't have to, maybe it's a little, it's an embarrassment of riches. So
that's not coming. I would doubt that was coming from the states. That sounds like a utility to me.
You never know where the suggestion is coming from. They all have the big suggestion box. Someone asked about the if you don't meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, what happens to the ITC, PTC? Basically, it's 1/5 of the amount that if you would qualify for, you had met those standards or been exempted from those requirements, and that runs across the board to the various bonuses.
I think Chris mentioned earlier, there's a cure period too. If you haven't met the prevailing wage, you can cure by topping up.
Yes.
The delta.
Yeah, that's important. I think we talked about that coming into this, but I don't think we talked about it here. So it's worth sort of saying that, with the prevailing wage, especially where it's an ongoing requirement, really good news is that if you don't meet that, you have the ability to cure it by effectively paying a penalty, which is slightly more than would have been if you had paid prevailing wages. So they make it so it's not, for tax equity investors, that's going to be pretty critical to not lose 24% of your ITC, or rather 80% of your ITC by a foot fault on a prevailing wage issue.
Yeah, that's very important, given the fact that you'll have to continue to comply for 5 years under the ITC and for 10 years under the PTC. Anyway, there are a lot of other open questions as well. I just had a client who had a problem with a project. It didn't satisfy the domestic content provision because it was already in construction, but within the first year, one of the components broke down and they had to get a replacement component. And so the question arose, well, how do you know that you're going to continue to meet that domestic content? Would that be a violation? Would there be recapture under those circumstances? In any event, I don't know if there are any final comments from Chris and Karen, but we've reached the end of our period. I would like to thank everyone for joining us for this. I'd like to particularly thank Karen Berry, Managing Director of NT Solar, for participating in this conference. Chris Emick, Head of Pierce Atwood Tax Group. My name is Merrill Kramer, Project Finance Partner also at Pierce Atwood. Thank you for joining us, and we will be posting, there will be a recording of this, and we will be posting the slides as well for your use later. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Meryl. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks to you, Karen. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.